What is a supply chain? We have one example where we, as CASA, work since 2012, since the massacre of Marikana, where 34 mine workers were shot by the police, most of them in the back. And we started to dig into the whole of the mines, dig into the whole of the mine companies, and also into the supply chain. We followed the platinum, which was found in the earth of Marikana, brought out by mine workers. And we tried to follow that along the so-called supply chain. That means it starts in the mine in Marikana, then it goes to the stock market of Johannesburg. It went through the stock market of London, and in the end, it was in our neighborhood in Mannheim and Ludwigshafen at the big chemical company BASF. So when we talk about supply chains at the moment, most of us might think of how do we get vaccination, how do we get face masks to be safe from the virus. So there is one supply chain, which means how do we get our stuff, food, other products, material. But the other side is the supply chain to be able to produce something at all, a car, a mobile, a house, a computer, whatever. So each and every item has a long journey to go. I think we were talking with confirmants the other day that, for example, a jeans or a t-shirt goes around the world 2 or 3 times before it reaches us. So those ways, those routes they take, they are on their way a lot of people connected to that product, be it the worker in the ground, the mine worker, when it comes to the platinum mine. Kati Plato is working with her partner organization in the DRC. And when we think of DRC, we think of coltan and lithium, which is needed for solar panels. So whatever we have, be it good or bad for our economy and for our life, there's a supply chain. And the idea of the supply chain responsibility is that we need to make sure that whatever we buy, there's no blood on it. I don't want to go back all at each and every product and ask, is that t-shirt, where does the cotton come from? Do the workers on the ground earn enough money to survive? What about the climate change? What about biodiversity? I don't want really to be able or to need to ask those kind of questions. I want to make sure that whatever I buy is in line with human rights, with labor rights, with climate, with biodiversity. But in reality, it's the contrary. Yeah. So the question is, why is it? And what can we do about it? And since quite some years, the United Nations work on the question of guiding principles on business and human rights. Because when we started a discussion about governments and human rights, it's more than 20 years ago that I was part of a discussion where we tried to establish the International Criminal Court, for example. And during those debates, it was very clear that most of the time, not the governments were those who do the biggest harm to human race, to our environment, but big business, corporates, transnational corporates. But we hardly have any possibility to sue them. Our laws are, if at all, international law is between governments, states. You can go to the Human Rights Commission. We have a Human Rights Commission in Europe. you can go to the German government, but only people, real people, can be sued in front of those courts, not a corporate, not a company as such. And this was the idea of Professor John Ruggie, who was the UN Special Representative for Business and Human Rights. And he said, we definitely make sure that business is accountable for what they do, not only for their accounting, not only for their finances, but also for their human rights. And so the UN decided on guiding principles on business and human rights. And interestingly enough, South Africa and Brazil those days were one of those countries who supported that or brought it to the topic of the UN in the first place. So countries, especially like South Africa, who have a lot of raw material and suffer from those culprits, they wanted to make sure that they have a support on the international level to fight against human rights abuse, because their national laws often do not give them a chance to act against those businesses, especially if they are listed on the stock market, for example, in Germany or London or wherever in the world. So those guiding principles first asked governments, states, to make sure that they respect, protect, and fulfill human rights and fundamental freedoms, which are enshrined in our human rights agendas. But the next is very important and new to the whole discussion. The role of business enterprises as specialized organs of society performing specialized functions required to comply with all applicable laws and to respect human rights. And third, the need for rights and obligations to be matched to appropriate and effective remedies when breached. So that means when, for example, a big company like Lonmin, a mining company, when they have a mine in South Africa, they have not only to comply to South African law, but also in their respect to UK law. I was just in the process of saying EU law, but UK is not EU anymore, so it should be the UK. BASF in that respect. If we have platinum from South Africa bought by BASF in Germany, they need to make sure that from whoever they buy their platinum has to respect and they have to respect human rights and international labor laws, not only telling that, but proving that. Because when you go into the brochures of big companies like BASF or Lonmin, which doesn't exist anymore, but anyway, then you see very shiny corporate social responsibility pages where they say that they apply to all those laws. They do everything which is possible to make sure that people are safe, that the labor laws are looked after, that people are paid properly. But when you then go to the people and ask directly on the ground, you find that it's not true at all. For example, in the example of Lonmin and BASF, we found out that the mining company always told in their brochures and openly in public that they will build 500 houses for the mine workers. Effectively, they built 5. So they always talk about it, but they never do. And nobody's really looking into it. With laws on a national level or international level, everybody would, the mine workers themselves could go to courts and sue those companies for not making those those laws, working, so to say, not applying to them. But the UN guiding principles are guiding principles and are not laws. And if the UN is asking government states to respect, protect, and fulfill human rights, means that the governments themselves need to implement or write their litigation. And so the next process, the next level started in Europe and in Germany as well. After the UN working group then encouraged states to develop, enact, and update a national action plan on business and human rights as part of the state responsibility to disseminate and implement the guiding principles on business and human rights. This means the UN working group can only encourage governments to do so. But the international pressure, let's put it like that, was quite big, so that on the EU level on the one hand, but also on the national states like Germany, they started the discussion on a national action plan, how to implement, how to make litigation available on those issues. And in 2016, 5 years after the UN guiding principles were launched, Germany decided to keep it voluntary. But they decided also to monitor that at least half of all companies with more than 500 employees must have integrated human rights, due diligence, supply chain responsibility into their business processes. So they said that they will try and make it a voluntary initiative by private actors. And they thought that might be sufficient if they talk to those corporates, to the companies, and encourage them to apply those human rights due diligence processes in their own companies and report back. But it was also clear that if they don't do, the German government will have to look into the national action plan again and discuss further steps. And the monitoring process was started last year, where a small part of those companies with more than 500 employees had to fill a form, had to answer some questions on how they integrated those due diligence processes into their companies, how they want to make sure that human rights are protected along the supply chain from the beginning to the end. And in the end, only a very small part of those who have been asked sent back their questionnaires, replied to governments, so that hardly anything can be said about how those voluntary guiding principles have been implemented in companies that are, quite middle to big. When you have 500 employees in Germany, you are middle to media big company. So in the end, it was very clear that voluntary initiatives by companies are insufficient to effectively prevent negative impacts on human and labor rights or climate change and other issues. And in the coalition agreement of our current government, it was also very clear that if the voluntary initiatives don't work, if the monitoring shows that those companies are not complying, legislation is obligatory. So that means that legislation needs to be written and implemented and brought through the process of German government and parliament. tonight, as we sit here and as I speak, the coalition is meeting because in our government we have no agreement, although in our coalition agreement, in the written agreement of our government, they said that this is the process to go. At the moment, especially our Minister of Economic Affairs, Altmaier, is hindering this process. He's opposing, while the Ministry of Labor and the Ministry of Development, they are lobbying for those kind of legislations. And the big question is whether they will find a solution tonight or whether they will part and, which means if they don't find a solution tonight, we won't have any sort of legislation until the end of our election period. We in Germany, we will have to elect in September this year. So that means we won't have any sort of compliance and obligations in that direction. It is quite interesting that our Minister for Development, Müller, who comes from the quite conservative CSU, the Bavarian part of the Conservative Party, that he is very proactive and very positive and lobbying for a due diligence legislation, because he says, on the one hand, it's very important for those who already apply to human rights that they are not negatively affected by the international trade and by other corporates who don't do so, because they spend more money in maybe paying adequate wages, in making sure that they don't harm the environment, that they comply to existing laws. Others who don't do that might have better starting points, have cheaper prices, have better conditions. And he says that's not the way we can go forward in future, because his department, for example, the Ministry of Development, has to come into the areas where, for example, companies have exploited people, because poverty is rising, because the climate change is affecting people. So he's sort of brushing up everything after the Ministry of Economic Affairs and his allies have been working in specific areas. So this is one of his main ideas, that if companies would comply to human rights, to those labor laws, or to climate and biodiversity, people would have a better possibility to have a decent life, decent wages, and maybe also a better future. This is why he is he's on our side, let's put it like that. And when I say our side, I talk about the campaign for a corporate due diligence obligation in Germany. Mm-hmm. And this is a campaign mainly based in Germany. Mm-hmm. Are there any questions? Mm-hmm. This campaign is started in 2019 to make more pressure onto the German government to on the one hand, go the national action plan and make sure that legislation is in due course. And for the last month, there was a very intensive campaign, especially when it comes to members of parliament, because we know that every legislation which is done by the government needs to pass our parliament, and the parliamentarians are those who have the last say. And the more people in parliament discuss those kind of litigations, for example, before they go to parliament, and the more we try to influence our parliamentarians, the better chance we have that in the end we will have a sort of litigation which is due and which is worth talking about to support human rights along the supply chain. The campaign is still ongoing, but it's very clear if tonight there's no compromise found between those different parts of government, we will have a very difficult time to come. Still, it is clear that we will have to lobby and advocate for those kind of litigations with our parliamentarians. This can be done by nearly everybody. We have our parliamentarians just around the corner. We can go to them, call them, write letters. This is a very important part, and we can do that together as organizations. We can do that as congregations, as university groups, whatever. There's also a similar process going on European level. And the European Parliament has a legal affairs committee, and they also voted in favor of a European supply chain law, and some companies like BASF say we need it on a European level rather than on a German level only. And at the moment, the EU Commission is conducting a consultation on a possible European supply chain law. And there we can have the possibility to submit statements. There are prepared statements, for example, from this coalition, from the campaign. We could only just use and write to the EU Commission to make sure that they hear the voice of the people on the ground, of the organizations who have connections with people who suffer from that supply chain irresponsibility. And what can we do in other countries? For example, in South Africa. South Africa did not yet start to work on a national action plan, although they started the whole process. South Africa is on the one hand, they're sort of victim. It's at the beginning of the supply chain, for example, with miners, with raw material. But South African companies are all over the African continent also very actively violating human rights or the climate. So it means that on the one hand, you have corporates where you also can lobby for a national action plan to make sure that South African litigation is adapted as well. And it's always important to find out more about companies around the corner. Which are the companies our congregants, for example, work in? How do they comply? I just read an article this afternoon about VW in South Africa who suspended shop stewards. I don't know whether that is the German mother body of VW is aware of what is happening in South Africa at the moment. But this could also be an issue, especially in Port Elizabeth, where VW is very big. Companies are always, they're everywhere, and we have a lot of people who work for them. So we can make sure that we find out how the situation on the ground is, where they sell their products, and how they talk about their corporate social responsibility, for example. When we talk about Marikana, when we talk about other issues, we can also talk about vaccination and the right to have access to vaccination all over the world, not only if we are rich countries. We have found out that in the end we are all Marikana. That means in the end we all suffer if people on one part of this supply chain have nothing to eat, are dying, have a bad air to breathe, whatever happens, violence against women, name it. Whatever happens to all of us. And this is the reason why we think this supply chain responsibility, the due diligence, is so important also for our work when we come to our partnership, because we, on the one hand, we always talk about the global north, the global south, but in the end, we have only one Earth, and we are all part of this Earth together, and we have to find solutions to those kind of problems together.